Wonderful. Welcome back. We are excited to start our next section on living and commuting. And we will start by hearing about the new geography of remote workers and firms, evidence from France, from Filippo.
To work with my office mate, Davide Rigo, here in the audience. So I think I will be able to skip this first part in front of this audience. So let me directly focus on the literature that investigates the effect of remote working on firm performance. Some studies identify positive effects that are related to time savings that are partly reinvested in work-related activities. Other identifies positive effects in terms of job satisfaction, work-life balance, and worker retention. Other studies identify different sources of negative effects on firm performance, starting with increases in coordination and communication costs, lower opportunities for mentoring and managerial oversight. Some studies directly focus on knowledge spillovers. The idea here is that if remote work cannot fully replace in-person interaction, then it's reasonable to expect less opportunities to encounter and develop new ideas. And as a result, we might record a negative effect on both within and between firms' knowledge spillovers. In our work with Riccardo Crescenzi, we also show that these negative effects are enhanced by inadequate managerial capabilities and by the need to invest in certain technologies in presence of financial constraints. So another literature, a specific strand of literature, directly focuses on the effect of remote working on commuting patterns. There is now a recent but already pretty rich urban economics literature that provides the empirical framework, the theoretical framework, and empirical evidence in support of the idea that remote working is changing the internal structure of cities. We now have widespread evidence of a flattening of the rent gradient curve in many cities. We have certain studies that directly show evidence of a decrease in housing prices in central cities. And we also have evidence of an evolution of the geography of consumption in large cities, with consumption moving away from the city centers. Another literature directly focuses on individual commuting patterns, reporting a decrease in the frequency of weekly commutes and increase in the average distance of commute. The literature mostly relies on cell phone data, IP data, randomized control trial, and also some recent study on samples of matched employer-employee data. So in this work, we contribute to the literature by exploiting a matched employer-employee dataset that covers the whole population of private sector workers in France. We first measure the geographical distance between each plant and all the workers employed in that plant, and then we try to link individual commuting patterns to firm-level outcomes. Our empirical strategy relies on pre-pandemic differences in the skill composition at the plant level that determine plant-specific differences in plant-specific work-from-home potential. We try to answer two simple questions. First, how does work from home influences individual commuting patterns and the local labor market around each plant? And how do these changes affect firm performance? So let me briefly present the data. First of all, let me say that we focus on France. That provides a quite interesting case study. France is a relatively small country, but is also a large advanced economy with a complex industrial structure. It has an interesting geography, which combines large urban areas with suburban and mostly rural areas. And also, France recorded a 12% increase in the share of workers working from remote between 2019 and 2021. We focus on two main data sources. The first one is the DDS, la Déclaration annuelle des données sociales, that is an individual level dataset based on social security declarations. For each single worker, we have several different information. We have information on, for instance, gender, sex, 5-digit occupation, net and gross salary, other contractual characteristics, and so on and so forth. We also have information on the municipality of residence, the commune of residence. The commune in France coincides either with a small town or with a large neighborhood, an arrondissement of a larger city. We are also able to match each single worker to a firm and a specific plant. And for the plant, we have the exact geographical coordinates. That means that we are able to precisely geolocate where each single worker works. As I said, we start from the full universal private set of workers, but then we exclude certain sectors that are not relevant for our analysis, entertainment, education, health. We also exclude certain types of workers, atypical workers, interns, workers that work less than 30 days in a year or less than 160 hours. But we end up with a sample of roughly 800,000 firms and more or less 10 million workers per year on average. The other data source that we use is the FAR, the Fichier Approché des Résultats des Ans, which is a firm-level dataset that provides balance sheet information for the full universe of private sector firms in France. We also exploit two additional data sources to construct two different proxies of work-from-home intensity. The first one, our first measure is work-from-home potential, that is just the standard index based on Dingle and Neyman, and we construct with index using data retrieved from the ONET dataset. The second one is a proxy of work-from-home adoption that is constructed instead based on the actual data on work-from-home adoption as recorded in 11 European countries. And for this proxy, we exploit the European Labor Force Survey. OK, let me now present some stylized facts. First of all, we record an 8% increase in commuting distance between 2019 and 2022. This relevant increase appears to be mostly driven by workers in high work-from-home potential occupations, who record, on average, an 18% increase. Focusing on the second group, we can see that the change is even higher when we focus on new hires. So at least part of this phenomenon might be driven by workers that in some way change job and find employers that are located farther away from their residence. Another interesting pattern, new hires means a worker that in a specific year change job, that had a different employer in the previous year. Another interesting pattern has to do with gender differences in commuting patterns. We know that historically, women tend to commute less than men for different reasons, but mostly for the uneven family burden. And from this preliminary evidence, it looks like work from home might have contributed to reduce this historical gap. OK, so far I only showed you some aggregate patterns. Now we move to a worker-level analysis to try to get a better understanding of the underlying mechanism. So we run this simple worker-level model in which the dependent variables is either the work-home distance recorded by each individual workers, or the home-to-work rent differential, that is the ratio between the rent recorded in pre-sample period in the commune where the worker works, where the worker lives, and the rent recorded in commune where the employee works. And we have a similar proxy for density. On the right-hand side, we have our proxy for work-from-home potential interacted with year dummies. And we also have a set of individual-level covariates, as well as plant, industry year, municipality year, and occupational fixed effects. We rely on a cross-sectional data set. So unfortunately, we can follow firms and plants over time, but not workers. So at this stage, we consider our results as simple descriptive evidence in support of a main firm-level analysis. However, we are right now working on a procedure that should allow us to construct a pseudo-panel, and hopefully we should get soon more robust results. So here is the table that reports the effect on log distance. As you can see, we record a positive and significant effect in 2021 of work from home potential on the individual commuting distance. The effect appears mostly driven by new hires, and we record positive and significant effect for both males and females, but the magnitude is definitely higher for women. In this table, we replicate exactly the same model, changing the dependent variable. So we focus on log home-to-work rent differential. Results are symmetrical in a way. We find that work-from-home potential has a negative and significant effect on home-to-work rent differential for the whole population. The effect appears mostly driven by new hires. But comparing to the previous table, we don't find significant differences between males and females. Finally, we replicate, again, the same model, this time focusing on differences between home density and work density. And we record, again, a negative significant effect on the whole population, driven by new hires, and no significant difference between males and females. OK, let me now move to the firm-level analysis. So far, I provided some evidence on the fact that commuting distances in France have increased significantly between 2019 and 2022, and that at least part of this increase might be due to increasing work-from-home potential, in remote working, sorry. The idea is that if we have an increase in commuting distances, it means that the local labor market around each plant is now larger. What's the effect on firm? So let me be clear here. This is a very simple reduced form work, so we are not able to say much about the mechanism at play. For instance, we are absolutely agnostic about possible changes in bargaining power between employer and employees. The only thing that we can say based exclusively on a theoretical argument is that with larger labor market, we expect to see an increase in probability that employers and employees form a productive match. So if this is the case, we should expect a positive effect on firm performance. So we test this hypothesis with this simple model in which the dependent variable are different measures of firm performance. And on the right-hand side, we have the average distance recorded at the plant level, at the firm level, interacted with year dummies, together with a set of time-varying firm-level characteristics and firm, industry year, municipality year, fixed effects. So here are the simple OLS results. We find some evidence of a positive and significant effect on global value added and TFP. The effects on wage and log hour are not so clear. Of course, in this case, there are many reasons to believe that our measure of distance might be endogenous. So we propose two different instruments. The first one is, again, based on the index proposed by Dingle and Neyman. We construct this index at the occupational level, and then we aggregate it up at the plant level using the pre-pandemic skill composition measured at the plant level. So here we just show you the correlation between our plant level proxy for work from home potential and the actual work from home adoption recorded in 11 European countries according to the European Labour Force Survey. Our second instrument is a simple shift share instrument where the shares are once again the actual importance of each occupation at the plant level in pre-sample period. And the shift in this case is the adoption of work from home, so the change in the share of people working from remote in 11 European countries between 2019 and 2022. So we tried different samples. We also focused only on 3 countries that have a similar size as France, so Spain, Germany, Italy. We also tried with France itself. Results are more or less consistent. So here we can show you the relationship between our 2 instruments and the measure of average distance recorded at the plant level. And as you can see, there is the relationship is pretty flat before the pandemic, and then progressively rises afterwards. Here are the results of a second stage. In this case, the firm level average distance instrumented by our work from home potential instrument has a positive and significant effect on both global gross value added and total factor productivity. We only record a slightly positive and significant effect on wage only in 2020, and the same for working hours. Moving to our second instrument, the shift share instrument, in this case, we confirm the positive and significant effect on productivity with even higher magnitudes. The effect on wage, again, is more or less the same, but in this case, we find a bit more evidence of possible increase in the average working hours recorded at the firm level, both in 2020 and 2021. So let me conclude. The pandemic has led to, again, a widespread adoption of remote working, and this had increased the commuting distance between worker and firm, and it has facilitated the match in the labor market between employers and employees that are located far away from each other. As a result, we record that firms that had recorded a larger increase in local labor markets also experienced an increase in productivity growth. Thank you for your patience.
Can you go back to your last slide and just help us think about the magnitude of the productivity effect, for example? No, the last substantive slide.
Yep.
So just walk us. I want to make sure I understand the magnitudes, because these look like they're really big.
It's a standard deviation. Sorry, I should have made it clear.
Okay.
A standard deviation in distance associated with a 22% increase in productivity.
Well, that's the gross value added measure, but the TFP is the standard solo residual type approach at the plant level, done with industry level cost shares.
It's the Woolridge total factor productivity, yes.
Okay, but also, anyway, I think,
yeah.
So these effects are huge.
Mm-hmm.
There's little wage effects, but the workers get the benefits in the form of they pay less rent, which you also
mm-hmm.
showed, and they spend less time commuting, and lots of evidence suggests they like it. So you didn't say it this way, but unless I'm misreading it, these are hugely positive effects.
Yeah.
On productivity, on worker well-being, and so on. Is that how you read the results?
Well, these effects are definitely quite large and much larger than the one that recorded the OLS. So it's something we are working right now. Again, we're talking about a one standard deviation change. So it's something that is pretty relevant as a change in distance. It's not something that is common to most firms, I'd say. It is possible, and we acknowledge it, that part of this effect might be driven by other channels. Our instrument is based on the pre-pandemic skill composition. So if firms that had a higher presence of a certain type of occupations for some reason performed better after the pandemic for other reasons, then we might have an upward bias in this case. So what we are working right now on is to try to replicate this analysis for different firm types, different sectors, and try to see whether we find...
I agree that's a potential source of omitted variables, but you have a pretty extensive list of controls. You've got municipality fixed effects by year, so it's not a location effect. You've got industry fixed effects by year, so it's not a pure industry story.
Yeah.
So it's possible there could be something like that, but you've got a pretty rich set of controls already.
Yeah, let me say, in terms, probably what we haven't investigated enough is the technology side. So if some of those occupations are complementary to certain technologies that have a certain effect on productivity, that might partially explain our results.
Yeah, so when I first saw, I looked at the paper yesterday, I was like, oh, workers are living further from their employer. And I was like, that's not news to me. I mean, it wasn't like first order because we kind of had seen that. What I was very surprised, I didn't see until your presentation, this TFP stuff. And this is fascinating. But I'm wondering, I'm trying to understand how I should think about these regressions. Because I would have thought the first order effect is you have a set of firms that their TFP has just increased regardless of where their workers live. And you have a set of firms that are not in occupations that had this shock. And so I'm trying to understand like this log. I would have just sort of run a regression before I go to anything about distance, given this amazing data you have. Like you're sort of interpreting it as they've changed the size of their labor market. And I guess I'm not sold that that's what's going on with the productivity. I have to read a little more carefully. So that's one thing. I'd love to just see more on the TFP period. Just like this is a fascinating data source, and it's brand new as far as I know. Yeah. My second thought is on the rent stuff. It's very surprising to me that you found that these workers are paying less rent. And because I think our prior, like the Stanton and Tawari evidence is that workers actually need more space when they work from home. And I'm trying to understand how small a municipality is here. Like, is this just I can see them paying less in rent if there's a lot of heterogeneity within a municipality, so they're living further from the city center. Is that what you think is going on, or is it a difference in square footage? Or?
Just to be clear, sorry, I should have clarified it, it's rent per square meter.
It's rent per square meter.
Yeah. So it's consistent with the story of them moving far away and finding larger houses that are more affordable. Yes. And also we find the same result with density. And once again, we know that moving farther away from a city center in less dense areas, generally, they have more space. They have houses that are larger, more space. But yeah, point well taken, both points. The first one is, it makes sense. We should focus a bit more on the effect of productivity, regardless on the story of distance.
So really quickly, maybe you said this and I missed it. What omitted variable bias do you think you're solving with your instrument? Because your OLS gives such different results, yet they have the same rich fixed effects. So what's the remaining omitted variable bias? Because that's what I'm struggling with, is why did it change?
With what we saw, or what's the remaining, sorry?
I just want to know, your OLS is much smaller than your IV, and I want to know what type of omitted variable bias in OLS you think would drive that?
Regardless of possibly an effect on simply on measurement error, our idea is that many other channels might in some way lead to an increase in distance. We might have
measurement error in distance?
Sorry.
You're saying there's measurement error in distance?
Yes, there might be measurement error in distance. Our measure of distance is not perfect. We are able to perfectly geolocate workers where they live, but not wherever they work, but not where they live. For where they live, we rely on communes, but again, are a good approximation. Taken together, there are 36,000 communes in France, so we get the centroid of each commune, but again, it's not as having the exact coordinates. We're talking about the possible other effects. One story might be that certain firms that are struggling more, that are recording lower performance, struggle to find workers because they offer, worse conditions, and so they have to look farther away to find the same workers. Another story has to do with just heterogeneity in terms of the types of firms that were more likely to adopt work from home practices. So larger firms that were more exposed to foreign shocks during the pandemic.
Yeah, but you have firm fixed effects.
Yes, but we might have an evolution over time in this sense. Yeah.
So it's a different comment.
Yeah.
And this could be interpreted as both either as a potential mechanism for what's at work, or depending on how you want to interpret your regression, as maybe an omitted variable, although not necessarily a problematic one. There is some evidence, and it makes perfect economic sense, that in reaction to the pandemic, there was an increased investment in technologies, products, platforms that facilitated remote work.
Yes.
So if you were already a firm and it had an occupational structure that was suitable for remote work, there's good reasons to think that you experienced, relative to other firms with a less remote-friendly occupational structure, that you experienced a larger productivity gain. So Nick and I have a small paper that shows, for example, the direction of patent innovation in the United States shifted towards technologies that support remote work. So I don't know whether you want to think of that as an omitted variable, or it's just a mechanism, and the instrument you have is actually better suited for picking up that particular channel than your OLS measure, which could be a different, one potential explanation of why your IV effects are so much larger than your OLS effects. It's kind of consistent with your overall story, but it's it's different than the recruitment catchment area mechanism.
It is a very, very interesting point. Thank you. We'll have to think about it.
I was going to quick say, I think the result here is really important. There's a big debate about productivity effects of work from home. And I guess we've all I've certainly had this debate over and over again. And people always focus on individual workers. I would say, well, there's a bigger piece here. There's like another bit in addition. If you're a policymaker or a local government or anyone that steps, even the firm level, there's also this match efficiency and labor market effect. So I just want to highlight, I think it's a big deal, because even if you were to say individual worker productivity was, say, negative, your numbers here, coming back to what Steve asked, are really big. So I think you had work-from-home workers living, 30-40% further away. You times it by some of these coefficients, you're getting productivity effects of like plus 5%. So you could say, even if for some reason, I don't know, people working from home are less productive. I mean, we've seen, there's lots of numbers, but there's this offsetting effect, which is, in the policy debate, is an important point to make that keeps getting forgotten about. People keep focusing on only one bit, and there's a second bit that's big and positive.
Yeah. Thank you.
I had kind of an overarching question about this table, which is I'm not sure the units for distance are that meaningful. And so what I mean here is you're using a 1 standard deviation change in distance, but a 1 standard deviation in your entire sample is going to be very different from what a firm located in central Paris, what the change in distance that they're seeing is, from a firm located in a much more rural area. So I don't know if these effects look huge because you're using a 1 standard deviation change, which is not what density weighted, employment weighted, the typical firm in France is getting. So I'm kind of one way of addressing that might be simply doing these effects by, I don't know, deciles of how dense is the commune where the firm is located, and see if it's all concentrated in either the more dense or the less dense, something like that.
Yeah, this is a good point. We started with a log regression, but we realized that it was super sensible to small changes in small distances. So that's why we moved to, but yes, probably showing from the beginning heterogeneity by density or like focusing on a different between urban and rural areas might probably provide a
something
clearer
like
picture overall. Yes.
What's the effect of a 1 standard deviation increase in distance for firms in urban areas versus firms that are in less dense areas? Like,
yes. Right.
Can I just add the paper I mentioned earlier? It's with Yulia Zhestkova. I didn't want to leave her out, and it's in the AARP&P. That's the one on the direction of innovation.
Okay. Good enough. Okay. Thank you.
We're now going to hear about working from home increases work-home distances from Senna Koskin.
Thank you very much for having me in this workshop. So Well, our title is pretty suggestive. I will be talking about how working from home increases work-home distances. This is a joint work with Wolfgang Dauf, Hermann Gartner, Michael Stops, and Enzo Weber. These are all my colleagues from Institute for Employment Research in Germany. Okay, so I don't need to spend some time for motivation, so I will just jump into some descriptives coming from Germany. So this is just the average work-home distance for office workers in Germany over time. So these are the workers who are probably more capable of using working from home option. And we can see after the pandemic, there is a jump in the distance for office workers, work-home distance. When we look at a more long-term trend in Germany, though, we can actually see a couple different facts. So first of all, there is a secular increasing trend in work-home distance in Germany since 1999. And of course, we can directly see this gender difference, which is well documented in the literature. Women do not like to commute, or they would like to give up more in terms of wages in order to avoid commute, which is something that we can see. There is also a little bit of a business cycle component, probably due to the composition of workers changing around the business cycles. But then we can also see this after the 2020, little increase in work-home distance in Germany. Okay, so when we look at the map of Germany here, prior to the pandemic, we can see at the county level median commuting distances. And when you look at the map here, all these big cities, Munich, Berlin, and Frankfurt, and Hamburg, they have very low, median zero commuting distance. So basically, if you are living in Berlin, it means that you are likely to work in Berlin. That's why you are living in Berlin. So, and there is this relatively large commuting distances just across these big cities because people are just commuting to work in those big cities. However, when we look at the change in median commuting distances before the pandemic to 2022, we don't see a very clear pattern here. We don't really see that work-home distances increase more right surrounding of big cities, but rather like largest increases can be seen in more remote places in Germany. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? So we think COVID-19 as a shock to the prevalence of working from home, as we all know, and all occupations might have been affected, but the degree varies. And so the COVID-19 is basically creating this variation in the required amount of commute across occupations. And this is the variation that we would like to use in this paper to estimate the effect of home office potential on work-home distance. So we are basically not interested in how the distance is changing over time, but rather how cross-sectional varies over time along working from home potential. So let me first summarize our findings before I talk about them in detail. So work-home distance increased in Germany for workers, especially with high working from home potential, where this effect is stronger for new jobs. And this effect is also stronger for jobs in big cities. And we still find some evidence for home relocation. So people are actually moving away from big cities. There is some also evidence for that. And as a result, starting to work in big cities and moving away from big cities means that work-home rent difference is actually increasing after the pandemic. So these findings suggest that people have a different job search behavior now. They are searching in a larger radius without moving, and also moving outside of big cities without even job change, so which has implications for labor market and housing market. Okay, so the data that we are using is administrative social security records. The whole 80% of the labor force in Germany is covered, the whole employment histories of workers. And we have information on basic demographics and job characteristics and location of worker and firm. So currently, we are using the distance measure that we are using is the commuting distance, the driving distance across municipalities, the center of municipalities, where there are 11,000 municipalities in Germany. But our results are going to be updated once we have access to the exact geocodes, exact distances, hopefully in a month or so. So currently these are but it's still a very fine level of distance measure. So another information that we are using in this project is rent prices at the county level, where there are 400 counties in Germany. So we are basically using median rent price at the county level to show the effect on how the rent price, how the rent price of the work location changed and how the rent price of the home location changed. And home office potential indicator, from now on I will just call it HOP indicator across 5-digit occupations. So now let me talk about how we define this home office potential indicator using the German labor market information. So this measure is very similar to Dingle and Niemann measure, but we think it's more representative for German labor market and more detailed across 5-digit occupations. So there are working conditions from Berufenet, which is the similar version, German version of the ONET, where there are 73 working conditions in total. So on average, an occupation has around 9 working conditions, which can be just 1 for voice actors, for instance, but it can be as many as 24 for an occupation as master agricultural machinery mechanics. So these working conditions are about dimensions such as social distance, workplace, physical or cognitive burden, and on the working time distribution. So what we are doing is the following. We take each individual working condition among these 73 working conditions, and we decide whether that working condition is conducive, ambiguous for working from home, or more of a hindrance, okay? So we assign a value of 1, 0, or -1 for each working condition, and we take the average for occupations, and then we scale the working conditions between occupations to the 0-1 scale, where 0 will mean an occupation has no chance, no possibility of being done from home, and 1 will mean it can be fully done from home. So it's basically just the potential, not about the actual use. So, but then how it is related to the actual use of home office. So here we are aggregating these home office potential indicator defined at the 5-digit occupations to the 2-digit occupation level, taking the weighted average. And on the y-axis, we are showing in Germany how working from home use was across 2-digit occupations during the pandemic. And we can see it's very highly correlated with the actual use. So we believe it's a good measure. And also thinking about how this home office potential and the distance is related even prior to the pandemic. So these graphs show us 2019 levels across occupations, 5-digit occupations, and 5-digit industries. We can actually see that industries and occupations where home office potential is high, even prior to the pandemic, we see their work home distances are larger. So what we would like to think as a theoretical background, as we all know, in order to accept a job offer at a certain distance, either high wages or low housing costs must serve as a compensating differential. So we can basically write a utility function where it depends on wage, housing cost, and the commuting cost, okay? So then I would like to accept a job offer if wage minus the commuting cost is larger than the unemployment value plus the housing cost. So what does the pandemic do? Okay, so we can think as each job has actually a reservation radius, which depends on the wage and the number of trips required to go to that job, which is correlated with jobs working from home potential, okay? So if the potential is high, there is less number of required trips, commute required for that job. So thinking about this basic framework, we can think jobs with a high hope should have a larger reservation radius. That's the way that we are thinking. And COVID-19 is a natural experiment which creates variation in omega required number of trips for that job, hence a variation in work-home distance and work from home potential. So again, I would like to repeat our contribution here is not really talking about a time series evolution, but rather how cross-sectional variation change along working from home potential over time. That's what we are doing in this project. So this is our empirical specification, where the left-hand side variable is the distance. And on the right-hand side, we have the home office potential of occupation O for the job held by person J at a time t, and then the interaction of this home office potential with time month dummies together with all these fixed effects. Month fixed effect, 3-digit occupation fixed effect, state fixed effect, and 5-digit industry fixed effects. And controls include age, gender, and tenure in the job. So the idea here is the fraction of days which are not commuted is proxied by home office potential, HOP indicator. And so COVID shock, again, affects all occupations, but the strength varies. So the treatment variable here is COVID and the time, COVID dummy and working from home potential per occupation. So this interaction becomes our treatment variable. So the interesting object here is basically to show these beta coefficients, how they vary over time. And this is the result. Here we are plotting beta coefficients over time. So basically how the effect of HOP indicator on distance changed over time, okay? As you can see, there is no trend prior to the pandemic, but towards the end of 2020, we start seeing this increase, meaning that if you take the number around 7 towards the end, means that workers who have full working from home potential relative to workers who have no option of working from home increase their distance by 7 kilometers, okay? I will be more specific about quantitatives, but this is how it looks like over time. So now let me show you a little bit about quantitative and a little bit about heterogeneity. So since I showed you already, there is no pre-trend. Now I would like to run a simpler regression, okay, by excluding all these month dummies, but rather using only annual dummies for the pandemic years and for the, relative to the pre-pandemic years, but the same exact specification. And now I would like to show you the quantitative results here. So results here show that when we look at the first column, 21 means that in general, high HOP jobs or high HOP individuals relative to no HOP individuals have on average 21 kilometer higher distance, okay? So this is a higher number if we only take new jobs, and new jobs meaning jobs with less than 1 year of tenure, okay? And then these are the interaction terms, how this effect changed over time. And what is interesting, of course, we see these positive and growing coefficients in line with the graph that I just showed. And quantitatively speaking, for new jobs, this effect is big in the sense that for new jobs, people with high HOP relative to people with no HOP had 13 kilometer higher distance, which is about 40% of the baseline effect. Okay, so this cross-sectional variation changed quite significantly, although you might think 13 kilometers is not a big number, but relative to the baseline effect, it's an important number. So the fact that we still find significant effects and relatively large effects for existing jobs also indicate that the effect is not only coming from job changes, but also home changes. And I will be showing some other things to support that hypothesis as well. When we run the regression with log distance instead, for instance, this number here tells us that relative to, the difference increased by 16 percentage points. So, which means that the effects are a little smaller when we take log distance, consistent with the view that also in the US, I guess, there are some very large distances, some people who are commuting really, really long. Some effect is captured by that, but it's definitely not killing the size and the significance of the coefficients. Okay, so how we can interpret these numbers, as I already said, on average, high hop workers have 21 kilometer longer distance. So if you think as one standard difference in hop measure, the distance between those workers will differ by around 5 kilometers on average. And how this effect changed during the pandemic. So for new jobs, again, this effect corresponds to 30 to 40% of the baseline effect, which is around 2 to 3 kilometers. The difference between the one standard deviation difference between people with different hop. So now let's focus on only movers, people who either changed firms or change homes. Okay, we are always running the same regression by just changing the sample. Okay, and as we can see, the numbers are much bigger when our sample only consists of people who moved. Okay, especially if you look at the home change here, the coefficient is around 20, which means that if you change a home and if you were a high hop person, the effect on distance will be 20 kilometers higher than what it was prior to the pandemic. Okay, that's what the coefficient tells us. On the other hand, so our previous specification is basically assumes a linear effect of hop on distance, where here we would like to test a possible nonlinearity of the effect, where we are dividing the sample for people with hop below the median, above the median, and people with very high hop measure above 75th percentile. And we can see that the incremental effect of hop on distance also gets bigger and bigger when you move on the hop measure, where for high hop individuals above 75th percentile, the effect is much larger relative to others. So in order to summarize overall effects, so what we can do is the following. Let's take all workers in 2019 and 22. So 50% of workers stayed in the same firm and home on average. So now we are working on a better decomposition, more detailed decomposition for this. But this is just an overall summary. And 20% there's 20% of new entrants, more or less, and they had 8 kilometer higher distance than exiting workers. Okay, new workers have higher distance. When we focus on this 30% of workers who either change firm, home, or both, and then we look how their behavior is different across hop, what we see is the following. Workers who move to a higher hop increase their distance on average by 15 kilometers. Workers who move to jobs with similar hop measure also had 6 kilometer higher distance. This is suggestive that even if you stayed in a similar job, working from home, your potential didn't change, but working from home practice is just more realized, and you can still increase your distance. So is my time correct, or here okay, this is the countdown. Okay, yeah, fine. Okay, I have time. So now I would like to dig in a little bit deeper where this effect is coming from. So what we would like to do, we would like to add a couple other things to our regression. So in the first column, we are actually repeating our previous regression for new jobs only. Okay, so this effect, 16% log point effect, is the same as in the previous table. Now we are adding other things into the regression. So basically, we would like to understand to what extent these effects are driven by jobs in the big cities. So once we do that, in the third column, you can see that the coefficient decreases a little bit. And we actually see part of the effect is driven by the jobs in the big cities, okay? But when we also add the interaction of having a high hope job being in the big city in the pandemic years, so triple interaction, we see that the effect is getting very small because most of it is captured by high hope jobs in big cities after the pandemic. There is still some impact, but this is really significant, so which suggests that this is really something about people finding jobs in big cities without even moving there. Okay, so now what we are doing is the following. We change our left-hand side variable. Until now, it was always distance. Now we are changing it to rent at home location, rent at work location, and the difference of work and home location. So what I would like to emphasize is the following. I mean, it's been just mentioned previously in this workshop. The evolution of rents it's an endogenous outcome depending on how much people are willing to live in the cities versus in rural places. And around the pandemic, there was lots of interesting changes in that dimension. I mean, the cities were not very attractive. So we would like to, we don't want these evolutions to affect our results. So what we would like to do is just in general to identify cheap versus expensive places rather than just this irregular movements around the pandemic. So that's why we take 2018 rent levels at the county level on the second part of the regression, although the other results are here as well. So, and then we regress rent at the county level to same fixed effects, same controls and the interactions. So what we do see here as 5.67% is the following. People with high hope, on average, are living and working in more expensive places, okay? About 6%. And how this changed over time is the following. So the positive coefficient here tells us that now, prior to the pandemic, the way that high people are preferring more expensive cities became even more, even stronger. Okay, so they prefer expensive cities even more, where the negative coefficient here tells us that they are not living in more expensive cities anymore. They are rather preferring rural areas. So the difference is significant. So work to home rent difference is getting larger. And again, the same regression, we are again only focusing on movers, not everyone. So people who change home and people who change firms here. And what is interesting here is the effects are much stronger, especially for home changers. Look at the red dots here. If you are a person who changed home after the pandemic, it's very likely that you move to a much cheaper place, okay? So that the difference is getting very, very large for home changers. But also you can see like a slight positive coefficient for workplace, you are more likely to work in more expensive cities, but the effect is very large for home rent. So what we are going to do in the next rounds, we are going to use exact distance using the geocodes, and we are going to have the data for 23 very, very soon. We are going to update our results, and we are going to run the full decomposition of the distance change, where it is coming from by exact percentages. And for the next projects, I mean, we will be definitely working on this field. We would like to think about the effect on wages. But what we are thinking is the following. So it's a theoretically ambiguous outcome, right? So on the one hand, workers have a larger search radius, but it's also true for firms. They also have a larger catchment area. So it really depends on the relative bargaining power and outside option of firms and workers, whether we are going to see a positive or a negative impact on wages. That's something that we are still working on. So I think I would like to conclude here by just mentioning that. So we find an evidence for behavioral changes for job search and home relocation. People are reach farther away, better fitting jobs where firms can increase their catchment areas, which are definitely important determinants for future of labor markets. Thank you so much.
A couple things. One, it would be great to try to quantify the size of the rent savings associated with people who move in wage equivalent units for those people. That's just an empirical exercise. Second, your last argument about which way wages go, I think, is incomplete, because the surplus at issue is also being altered by when you live farther away, you're saving on rent, you're saving on commute time potentially if you're commuting less. That's part of the newly expanded surplus. So contrary, when you think about it that way, and that part doesn't go, those are unmeasured, those are non-wage amenity benefits of the job. So when you think about it that way, even though there may be some impact on the relative bargaining strength, there's a strong presumption that the out-of-pocket wage paid by the employer is going to go down for these. So I think you need to enlarge that, expand that aspect of your argument.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Definitely.
Very, very interesting. This fascinating new area. I have a question about the switchers effects in the early years in 2016 and 17, where you seem to have significant, though declining effects. And I was kind of wondering whether that's a tighter labor market stories and difference in tightness across different HOP type of occupations. I mean, in the US, I don't know about Germany, but that's essentially when you see the increase in tightness, 2019, very tight labor market, and then, quickly declining and then going up again. So you have that trend of labor market tightness there that could be consistent with the switching part of your story.
Yeah, so in our regressions, we have controls for industry and five-digit industry and three-digit occupation, which should be taking care of any different differential tightness across groups of markets, I guess. But I think your question is more like a general trend, right? Okay, thank you.
I'm over here. Thanks for presenting this. I think you made some really convincing arguments about what labor markets could look like and the impact on cities and towns. I'm curious from a policy perspective what you think this would suggest for either downtowns trying to retain their talent or for smaller towns that might be trying to take advantage of and provide themselves upon this influx of workers.
Yeah, it's a good question. To be honest, at the moment, I don't think we can answer. I mean, we can talk about any policy suggestions before really answering then what are the impacts of this in terms of labor markets, in terms of inequality, in terms of workers' bargaining power and housing market, right? I think the next step should be really understanding, given this, what's going on, and then probably maybe a policy about better commute, more infrastructure for commuting. I don't know. Things like that might be in the list, but at the moment, I think I don't know about, yeah.
I was going to build on what Devin said. I think there's a really interesting implication here, which is more people work in cities, potentially more people work in city centres. So all this work from home movement, people have said, many people here have been like, it's damaging cities. I think probably on net it is, but you have it relates to what Simon had yesterday, and also Filippo's paper earlier. Potentially there are more workers supplying to city centres. People aren't living there. So it's like on net, it's not obvious. And I was kind of thinking of Devin's thing, for US cities, like, do you tax where people live or where they work? Because it turns out mostly, I think it's on where they live, which is problematic. But if you taxed on where you work, San Francisco wouldn't be seeing such a dramatic drop in tax take. So the policy is a big deal, actually.
Yeah, so do you see mode switch? Because I think one of the big concerns I have about a lot of this move away, I thought it was more of an issue in the US, is that we've subsidized really, really heavily this car-centric infrastructure. And my concern, not only long-term, I was talking a little bit at the break, not only do you see workers moving out, but eventually if the workers all now are commuting by car and we've created all this space for the cars, then the firms move out of the city centers as well. And then you get this huge decrease in agglomeration economy. So I actually think it's very concerning, the policy implications. Can you see mode of transportation in your data?
Yes. Yes, I mean, we can definitely check that. I'm just thinking, I think we never looked at it, but yes, we can definitely check that. I was just thinking about how we should be removing business cycle effect from switchers, because I think it's very, very correlated with business cycles, the way that there are more movers, exiters, or entrants in general, right, with the labor market tightness. But yes, we can do that, definitely. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're now going to hear from Mert about Americans now live farther from their employers.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. This is Americans Now Live Farther from Their Employers, and this is work with Jose, Nick, Shelby, Steve, Hyosol, and Liz. And just to motivate this, especially in the context of the US, here we are looking at percentage of paid days worked from home, and this comes from survey working arrangements and attitudes that Nick, Steve, and Jose conducts every month. And about 28% of paid days worked from home in the US are work from home days. And this has been stable over time, especially in recent months, and it's about 4 times the level of what it was before the pandemic. And currently about 40% of full-time employees in the US are fully work from home setting, where hybrid is more common. About 26% of all workers are in hybrid setting, and about 14% are in fully remote setting. So in this paper, we're interested in how this shift, this lasting and persistent shift to work from home, is reflected in the distances from worker homes to employer locations. And today I will talk about first trends in this distance over time. I will show how it varies with worker characteristics. And lastly, I will have a preliminary section on some results on separation and hiring rates of workers by distance. And to do all of this, we'll use anonymized data from a payroll company. We'll construct a matched employee-employer data. And for the main analysis, we'll focus on employees of a monthly balanced panel of firms from 2019 to 2023. We'll also supplement this with survey of working arrangements and attitudes. So let me quickly give more descriptions on the data and the measurement, then I will move on to the time trends, and the last section will be on the results on separation and hiring rates analysis. As I said, the data set for this project comes from a payroll company. It's called Gusto. It provides payroll services, tax and other services to mostly small and medium-sized employers. And importantly for our purpose, it also has the location, the address of employees and their employers. We'll use this to compute the distances. For the main analysis, as I said, we're using a monthly balance panel of firms from 2019 to 2023. It has about 1,600 firms, 16,000 firms and about 450,000 employees. We'll measure the distance as the Haversine distance between the geocoded, so the exact location of employee address and home address for workers. And we'll do one main cleaning step, which is in some cases, multi-location employees assign a single location for their workers for payroll purposes. So this, if we take it as given, would lead us to overstate the distances that we are documenting. So in order to deal with this, what we'll do is if a firm has very high share of their workforce very far away, and specifically if it has on average more than 25% of their workforce farther than 50 miles, we'll just remove that firm and their employees from the balance panel. If we were to keep these employees, you will still see the same trends that I document, except the trends will be shifted up. And in order to increase representativeness, we'll also weight the individual level data by the cross-product cells of age bins, sex, annualized earnings bins, and major industry group to match the densities of the same cells in the current population survey. Right, and additionally, we will also supplement some of the findings with the survey of working arrangements and attitudes. Specifically, we'll focus on 20 to 64 years old full-time workers, and we will use the measure on the percent of days the respondent worked from home, and also we'll geocode we'll use the centroids of the respondents' home and employer locations to compute the distances for them as well. Okay, let me quickly move to the time trends. So first, on the left graph, what we're looking at is the average distances winds-rise at 250 miles over time from 2019 to 2023. And what you see is this huge increase over time. About in 2019, the average distance was about 16 miles, and that increased to about 26 miles. And on the right, you're looking at a similar time series plot, but what we are looking at is percentage of employees living more than 50 miles away. And there we see similar increases. It used to be about 4% of employees in 2019. That jumped to that more than doubled to about 9% of employees now. Great, and in order to better understand how this development is coming to be, we split our sample into two groups. Those who were hired before March 2020, the onset of the pandemic, and those who were hired after March 2020, and that line is in the blue there. And what we see is, if you look at employees who were hired before March 2020, they've shown some increase in the percentage of employees that live more than 50 miles away. Before the pandemic, it was about 4%. At the end, it's about 4.8%. But what we see is the blue line is much higher than the line in the bottom. If you look at employees who were hired in March 2022 or after, currently at the end of our sample, about 11% of them are living farther than 50 miles to their workplace. And when the last plot was percent of employees living more than 50 miles, we can also look at the mean distances for the winds-rise means, and we see again similar patterns. And in addition to looking at percent living above 50 and winds-rise distances, we can also look at other parts of the distribution to better understand where in the distribution this shift is coming from. And here I'm showing you the median and 75th, 90th, and 95th percentiles. And the y-axis scales are very different, but what you do see is an increase across the percentiles over time, suggesting that this is not just driven by outliers or the right tail, changes in the right tail of the distribution, but this is a shift in the distribution of distances over time. Right, and then I will talk about how these trends vary with different worker characteristics. So here are we're looking at the percent of employees living more than 50 miles away by age bins. The blue lines are 2019 averages, and what you see is, and the lighter bars are the 2023 averages, the age group that has shown the largest increase in those who live far away are those who are in their 30s, particularly early 30s. You see similar trends if you look at share of days worked from home by age, for example, where it's the highest for those who are in their 30s. And if you think those group are as parenting age workers, they have a higher demand for flexible and hybrid work. This may be consistent with that. So for example, about 4% of those who are in 30 to 34 years old used to live more than 50 miles away. In 2023, that is more than 10%. Great, and then we can also look at this by annualized bins for annualized earnings, and what we see is percent of those who are living away is highest for higher earners. So for example, if you look at those who are earning anywhere from 10,000 on an annualized basis to 100,000, they have shown some increase from about slightly less than 4% to maybe about 5%, but the largest increase that we see is the line above and the top, which is for those who are earning more than $250,000 on an annualized basis. Right? And then we can also look at it by industry, and here we see enormous differences in this trend across industries. So if you look at industries that typically don't have a lot of work from home opportunities, such as accommodation and food and retail trade, the lines at the bottom are construction, healthcare. Those lines have shown some increase, but have mostly remained flat. Whereas if you look at information, professional services, and finance, those have seen huge jumps over time. For example, if you focus on information, about 30% of workers in information are living more than 50 miles away. And similar to what we have done before, we can also split the sample again into two groups, those who were hired before March 2020 and those who were hired after March 2020, and we can look at this by industry. And the last column, the percentages there are, again, we are looking at percent of those who live more than 50 miles. The last column is those who were hired after March 2020. And across rows, across industries, if you look at it, those numbers are higher than the column for hired before March 2020, suggesting that across industries, these increases that we document are driven by those who are hired after March 2020. But this also shows that there's some variation in the extent of this, how much this is driven by new hires. So for example, if you look at accommodation and food services, about 2% of the employees who were hired before March 2020 lived more than 50 miles away. And that is about 3.2% for those who were hired after. If you look at information at the bottom row, about 13% for those who were hired before March 2020. That jumps almost to 3 times as high to 38% of workers for those who were hired after March 2020. Great, and then here, I'm showing you a bin scatter plot of percent of those who were hired, percent of those who live more than 50 miles away on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the median home value in employer's location. And what we see is a positive and tight relationship between these two, and this could be consistent with the idea that now remote work could allow people to work in expensive locations with expensive housing markets without workers having to live there. And we can also check how percent days worked from home varies with distance from home residences to employer locations using survey of working arrangements. And here again, we are focusing on the sample of US workers, 20 to 64 years old, who are working full-time. And what we see is as distances increase, the x-axis here is distance on the log scale. As distances increase, the percent of days worked from home roughly, very roughly, around 50 miles, rapidly increase. Okay, in the last part of the presentation, I'll talk about the separation and hiring rate analysis. For this, so up until now, when we were documenting the time trends, we focused on employees of a balanced panel of companies. For this analysis, we're expanding the analysis to all available companies in Gusto, which significantly increases the number of companies we have and the number of workers we have. Okay, and here we are interested in understanding how separation rates of employees vary with monthly company growth rates. And specifically, we're looking at two groups, those we call far employees. These are, again, those who are living more than 50 miles away, and near employees, those who are living, the remaining employees, those who are living less than 50 miles away. And the way we construct these plots is we first calculate company month level separation rates for far employees and near employees. And we regress these estimates, on the bins for monthly company employment growth rates. So that allows us to non-parametrically look at this relationship, how separation rates vary with monthly company growth rates. And when you're at the left side of the 0 on the x-axis, those companies are contracting in employment. And when we're on the right side of the x-axis, those companies are those who are expanding in employment. And what we see is when companies are contracting, the separation rates for far employees the green line is above the separation rate for other employees, those who are living nearby. And analogously, we can look at hiring rates and how hiring rates vary with monthly company growth. And what we see is when companies are expanding, when we're on the right side of the x-axis there, the hiring rate for far employees is above hiring rate for near employees. The green line is above the blue line, right? And you can come up with many explanations as to why this could be the case. In particular, it could be a distance to work site effect, or it could be driven by other observable characteristics of far employees that are different than near employees. In a regression setting, we'll try to account for this next. So to do this, we will consider the individual level data that went into producing those plots that I have shown you, and specifically we will regress an indicator for separation of the employee on the interaction between contraction, which we define as a company growing below -5%, and we'll interact that indicator with far employee. And in column 1, if you look at column 1 and the interaction coefficient, in column 1 we don't have any fixed effects, we're not controlling for anything, and the interaction is positive and significant, again not surprising given the plots that I have shown you, suggesting that far employees, when companies are contracting, are about 1.6 percentage points more likely to separate. That's about 10% more likely to separate. And in column 2, we are adding fixed effects for tenure on employment in months. And what we see is the interaction remains significant when we add that. And we gradually, in column 3, we are adding age fixed effects. In column 4, we are adding gender fixed effects. And what you see is, to the extent that the fixed effects that we're adding capture the observable characteristics differences between far and near employees, our results don't seem to be changing much. It suggests that when companies are contracting, far employees are indeed separating at higher rates. And we can do the same thing looking at new hires as companies are expanding. So we're specifically interested in looking at the interaction between expansion, which we define as company employment growth above 5%. And if you look at column 1, the 2.36, that suggests that when companies are expanding, far employees are about 16% more likely to be hired than near employees. And as we add more fixed effects, the estimate, the magnitude and significance remains similar. Okay, let me conclude, because I want to have time for questions as well. So we documented a large increase in the share of workers who live more than 50 miles from their employers. This reflects mainly the fact that employees hired since March 2020 are more likely to live far, and it is most pronounced for workers in their 30s. It rises with earnings, annualized earnings, and it's highest in information, professional services, and finance. And lastly, in the last section, we looked at employees who live far from their employers have higher separation rates when companies are contracting. Employees who live far from their employers, again, have higher hiring rates when companies are expanding. And taken together, these could suggest far employees being more variable labor inputs for companies. Thank you very much. I will conclude and take questions.
Thanks. I thought that was really, really cool. I had one clarifying question and then another one. But so for the last few things you showed, I didn't notice time fixed effects in there. Is that something you guys have done also? Because I'm wondering if you're pooling data from before, during, and after the pandemic, and there's big shifts in when these long distance hires happen, maybe this is being affected by, labor market conditions as opposed to.
Yeah, great question. So if you produce these plots that I've shown you separately for looking at, say, 2017 to 2019, you still see the similar differences, which is interesting. And I did add month fixed effects in this setting, and it didn't seem to move things around at all.
Very cool. And then the last one was, maybe you just don't have enough people to do this, but I wonder if there's a small number of people that you can see separate from one firm in your data set and then join another firm. And one story I've kind of wondered about is whether if you're a remote worker, if you have a larger pool of firms to search for, maybe you could get a higher wage because you can look all around the country. And so I guess you could compare people who separate from one firm to another firm in the data set who look like they're a remote worker or not a remote worker and compare the wage gains. I don't know.
Okay, that is a good question. So one thing I mentioned before as well is like the companies that we work with tend to be small and medium-sized companies. And so we would only see someone moving to another company and appear in our data if the company ends up using the same payroll services. I didn't look too much into that, but I can try to see. We do have a lot of observations. I'm sure there are some people in our sample that we could identify, track with the employee IDs. But yeah, that's a great point. But I can try to do that. Yeah, thanks.
So thank you for presenting a very interesting work. And this is more of a comment, less of a question. And trying to connect this piece of work to Lisa's work and Maria's work early in the morning. So there is an old literature in OB which shows that couples in dual career situations, the penalty is mostly borne by women. And I wonder, like, if in your data set or in future work, you could analyze whether moving more long distance is helping women now overcome that dual career penalty. Because, if the spouse moves and you have to move and find a new job, maybe that's more difficult than if you can maintain your old job. So just like a request for future work on that, because I think it'll be really cool beyond the child penalty to show the dual career penalty is mitigated by remote work.
Thanks.
Hi there. Excuse me. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating paper. I'm really curious about people that moved during the pandemic. And I know that you've included that in your analysis. And I just wanted to kind of rethink about that a little bit, because it seems like there's a lot of things happening during the pandemic and we're not sure why people moved. I don't think there's great data on what the forces were that were pushing or pulling people to move, especially it seems to the suburbs. Like that's, at least in California here, that's been a big movement and that's clearly reflected in real estate prices. But was it more space? Was it a kind of a natural inclination to be in the suburbs. They prefer that convenience or that lifestyle. Is it other factors that are kind of leading in there? And I'm just wondering to what extent you're able to or need to control for those kind of factors in this later analysis.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we don't have great data on who moves because, for example, the plots that I showed you that looked at people who were hired after March 2020, we only see them as they change jobs. So we don't see them, as I explained before, because we cannot track one employee, or at least most of our employees, as they change jobs, we don't necessarily see that aspect. But yeah, thanks.
One thing on these regressions, I would be curious about seeing what would happen if you interacted expansion/contraction with pay. Because I could see, you said before, like, the 4 employees were higher paid. Like, if I'm a contracting firm, I want to, like, get rid of some of the really expensive people first.
Yeah, we can definitely do that, yeah.
Yes.
And this is really great. Another sort of related comment on the occupation compositions. I really find the separation and expansion fascinating. So the occupation composition in the idea of Caliendo and others, so would have like, you have a demand shock, and then that's where the firm actually expands and adds by adding layers, so by adding different occupations. I don't know if you see it in the database, but I don't know. Maybe because those that are further away, there are particular occupations that are being kind of get rid of. And maybe you can capture it with the wage.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we can look at wages. We cannot look at occupations because we don't have the occupation data. We have industry, but we don't have occupation, yeah. But we can look at how it interacts with wages. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just coming back to the policy implications of this. There's a great paper by Gilles Duranton on speed, and it's an RE stat a few years ago. And cities in the US do differ by how easy they make driving. And if on the one hand, a larger labor market is a good characteristic of a city, right? This allows for more agglomeration economies. On the other hand, we know density is also something about cities that makes us more productive, right? And so if we're sort of creating infrastructure that allows people to move really far away, I don't know, it'd be interesting to see how much of this is sort of facilitated by cities. And if you look at the cities that have high driving speeds, they're like cities nobody wants to live in. They're in like Dallas and like Akron. Like nobody wants to live in these cities. But I mean, I guess people, anyway, I'll stop. But it would be interesting to see how much the infrastructure is facilitating these choices. And if you see sort of cities with lower commuting speeds not moving as far away, it'd be kind of cool to see.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely do more on location. We can also look at taxes and how that affects things. Yeah, we can definitely do more on location, city infrastructure and others, yes.
Yes, this is also a request for more research, maybe more questions you can ask down the road, but especially given the increase in long-distance living for the people in their 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
I wonder how many of these moves are not just for sort of housing affordability or housing size reasons, but also to be closer to family for childcare purposes, right? So to what extent are those family or friend motives driving the choices of where people are moving to?
Yeah, great question, thanks.
Excellent study, and I'm very interested in understanding how, like, you measure the distance between your employee and the employer, but actually many teams now meet at off-site locations. Like they are further away from the headquarter office, but they meet at some convenient location for the team members. I'm wondering whether you could measure, like, whether the distance between team members change after the pandemic.
Yeah, that is a question. Good question. The way we measure, our measure for where employees and their employers are located are the ones that employers report for tax purposes. So if the employer, it is, yeah, I'm not sure if we can exactly capture.
Maybe for some small firms, like with just a few employees, you can check whether the distance between different employees also changes.
Yeah, that's a great question, yeah. We can do that there.
Hi, don't want to keep everyone from lunch. Nice presentation. I was just wondering, 2 questions. One, did you consider distributed models for work from home? Because I imagine your Windsorization strategy doesn't account for that, because you're Windsorizing before March 2020. So like Atlassian, you can work in any office, and they might have started assigning people to one office after the pandemic. So I might be working in New York, but everyone's assigned to the San Francisco office, but I can go into any office. That wouldn't be really living farther from your employee, and it would be a shift towards that kind of.
I see. So you're saying there could be time varying variation on how people assign. They may be more likely to assign a single location for multi-location employees.
Exactly, if you shift to a distributed model. But I think it will only reduce your estimates a little bit. And the second question was in your expansion contraction regressions. How does that work for firms that are fully remote? Did you exclude those from, right? Because mechanically, far workers will separate when a fully remote.
Yeah, I didn't look at the heterogeneity. I actually didn't look at the subsample of fully remote firms. Actually, that's a good question. I should do that. Yeah, thanks. I think that's it.